Hello, my name is Isaac with Medieval Collectibles, and today we're exploring the Authentics Warhammer. One of the most iconic armor-piercing weapons of the medieval period, the Warhammer is a classic example of how military technology changed from the end of the Viking Age in the 10th century to the late Renaissance in the 15th century. Clubs, maces, and other bludgeoning-type weapons have been used ever since the dawn of civilization, but by comparison, hammers were rarely seen as they were slower and less accurate than swords, and as such, they were largely delegated to building tools. But over time, armor crafting techniques improved and created armor that could stand up to blades. Bare skin and clothes gave way to chainmail and leather, and soon enough, chainmail hauberks and leather cuirasses gave way to steel armor in the form of full plate. Most swords couldn't pierce steel plate by the late 1300s. They would often glance off on impact or fail to penetrate on a successful thrust. It was around the era of the early Renaissance, primarily the mid-14th to late 15th centuries, when warhammers like our friend here saw extended action in multiple conflicts. Now, you might be wondering how warhammers were used during the 10th century. The earliest mentions of battlefield hammers from the 10th century actually come from engagements between the Byzantine Empire and a people known as the Ruthenians. The Ruthenians were, in no uncertain terms, an Eastern Slavic people near modern-day Ukraine and Poland who were descended from the Kievan Rus, also known as Eastern Vikings. Located as they were, Ruthenian dukes and other Norse lords of the East would often wage wars against one another. Occasionally, they even butted heads with the outermost armies of the Byzantine Empire. Like their Viking ancestors, they would wage war in massive shield wall formations, throwing missiles at one another before closing in to fight with swords, axes, and, you guessed it, hammers. Fast forward to the mid to late 1300s, and we have several recorded instances from first-hand accounts and archaeological evidence of knights fighting with warhammers. First off, we have the Battle of Visby, located in Gotland. Gotland being the island between Sweden and Latvia in the Baltic Sea. In 1361 AD, King Valdemar IV of Denmark marched on the island with an army of elite mounted knights and hired mercenaries from mainland Europe, primarily from Germany and the Baltic coast. That army, besieging the city of Visby, engaged in several skirmishes with the local defenders, dealing heavy casualties. Eventually, resistance from the city capitulated, and the King of Denmark captured the city. Later archaeological digs of the area showed evidence of skulls with puncture wounds that historians and archaeologists believe came from early warhammers. Some 21 years later near Flanders, Froissart's chronicle on the Hundred Years' War details the use of warhammers during the Battle of Rysbeek in 1382. A Flemish army under the command of Philip van Artevelde, seeking independence from French rule, engaged the Royal French army near the town of Rysbeek. After the French cavalry outflanked and charged the Flemish pike phalanx, to devastating effect I might add, Philip was killed and his heavily armored citizen soldiers were soon surrounded in isolated pockets and crushed. And I mean that literally. In Froissart's own words, so loud was the banging of swords, axes, maces, and iron hammers on those Flemish helmets that nothing else could be heard above the din. Never before in so great a battle in which so many were killed had so little blood been seen flowing. This was because by far the greatest number were crushed or smothered to death. Even though the Flemish soldiers were well armored, that did not help them as much as they were hoping for. They were pressed so tightly together by the better trained and equipped French that many of them suffocated and many more died from blunt force trauma. Even though we have ample evidence of warhammers being used in early to late medieval history, it wouldn't see widespread use until knights and professional soldiers equipped them for the various wars of the Renaissance. This warhammer is inspired from mid-15th century designs, just like the warhammer shown here from the Met Museum Arms and Armor Collection in New York. Professional armies would begin to replace feudal levies, armor crafters were even better at their trade, and many of these professional armies were equipped with armor the likes of which their ancestors could only dream of. Naturally, as historical cause and effect dictates, an increase in defense means innovations in offense to counter it. Warhammer circulated all throughout Europe alongside early firearms and cannons to deal with steel plate. From the way I see it, knights naturally picked up these warhammers as secondary weapons to be used against other knights. Striking blows to your opponent's helmet would not only stun them, there was a real chance you could deal serious internal damage to the skull or the brain. Even then, your opponent might already be suffering from a concussion as you flip it to the other side and finish them off with the piercing spike. On the other hand, striking an opponent upside the helmet could give you a momentary advantage while they are recovering from the blow. But you know how the saying goes, everyone has a plan until they get hit in the head with a warhammer. I think. First-hand accounts from the Italian wars of the 15th to 16th centuries detailed true warhammers being used to knock knights from their horses, often killing them before they hit the ground. During the Battle of Fornovo in 1495, one of the commanders of the Holy League was struck on the head with a warhammer and fell from his horse. He was already surrounded by French troops after having pressed too far into the enemy line, and he was killed for that mistake. By this point, even polearms had incorporated the hammer into their design. Poleaxes with hammerheads were common, warhammers were added onto long poles for added reach, and these types of polearms were effective at grappling with mounted opponents. Like the halberd, spikes on either side of the hammerhead made this weapon superb at piercing armor and the flesh underneath. However, there was a real risk of this spike or the beak getting stuck in enemy armor. Of course, it really came down to the fighter's training, the type of metal their weapon was made of, and the type of metal their enemy's armor was forged from. Like real military history, no combat engagement is ever cut and dry. So, what kind of design does this Authentics Warhammer have? Let's talk about the blackened iron forged head first, then make our way down to the pommel. The front hammerhead is perfect for concussive strikes against breastplates and helmets. It also features 4 pyramidal points in a quartered pattern. Like I've mentioned before, this type of head was excellent for bludgeoning armor. Next up, as you can see, the beak here at the back allows for devastating puncturing strikes. This type of curved spike was called a crow's beak or a crow's bill, typically sharpened to a fine point. This top spike, although little used, was probably not vestigial. In a pinch, this spike could have been used for thrusting attacks. I imagine this would have been useful against softer targets like the underside of a horse or the undefended weak spot of an opponent. The spike itself is designed with a diamond pattern. The base here supports a point at the very tip. Seeing as how this warhammer isn't sharpened anywhere, it's safe to handle as long as you're responsible and wearing the proper safety gear. The entire head is not just attached to the handle, it's riveted to it on both sides, thanks to sturdy languets all the way down. Most swords have languets too, but these languets have been dialed up to an 11 in all the best ways. These languets not only look cool, they firmly secure your warhammer and make sure your handle can stand up to any punishment. By the way, the languets distribute the weight evenly across the handle and give you a surprisingly balanced grip for a warhammer. As you might assume, making a warhammer that's intentionally top-heavy gives you increased power on the swing, and you get the best of both worlds with this weapon. Speaking of the grip, the handle is hardwood that's been seared to an almost pitch black, matching the black iron look. Instead of being like a circular baton, here we have a rectangular haft that's rounded on each side, giving your grip added security and strength when wielding it. Rounding out the handle, here we have a pommel with diagonal grooves on all sides. The very bottom of this pommel is a nice domed extension to really unify the design. Not only is this weapon great at smashing dummies and practice targets, it's bound to be a great centerpiece in your collection. Tell a tale of military history with a weapon that evokes the proud history of hammers across the medieval world. Or set it up next to your favorite suits of armor like the portrayals of Europe's finest. For example, be like the Prince Elector Moritz of Saxony, who's holding his own warhammer as depicted here. You could take inspiration from the Winged Hussars of Poland and the Holy League, who holstered their warhammers at their sides or hooked them onto their belts. By this point, you might be wondering, is this hammer good at smashing things? The answer I have to that is yes, it is good at smashing things. Now that we've gone over the looks and design of this weapon, let's see what it can do. I hope you liked our demonstration. I certainly like smashing stuff as much as the next person, but a weapon like this doesn't make a couple rounds around the historical block without sparking quite a few questions. First off, how come historical warhammers like this were so small? Anyone interested in medieval combat or military history can see that many Renaissance designs in particular had smaller heads than, let's say, a mallet or a sledgehammer. One reason for this smaller build could be related to inertia. A smaller head means less weight to carry around, meaning quicker and more numerous attacks. Another reason could be material costs. It simply wouldn't be too effective to create a massive hammerhead in the medieval period, whereas a smaller one can direct a lot more force onto a smaller area. Second, with how effective it is, wasn't the hammer typically seen as a symbol of strength and power? Well, yes, in fact. Certain people throughout history were nicknamed the Hammer because of their military strength. King Edward I of England, responsible for defeating the Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, was given the epithet Hammer of the Scots centuries after his death. Charles Martel, ruler of Francia who turned back a Moorish army at the Battle of Tours in October 732, earned the moniker Charles the Hammer. He was given that name after decades of smashing and decisive victories over rival tribes and the Muslim Moors in western France. So, the last question one might ask, did either of these figures actually use warhammers? In both cases, no. Neither King Edward I nor Charles Martel used warhammers during their military lives. Focusing on Charles Martel, several artworks depict him using either a sword or an axe, two commonly used weapons for the time. The earliest were from the early 19th century as shown here. Others that came later only gave him the warhammer in retrospect because, well, that's what he was called. They likely wanted to help distinguish him from the rest of his army as shown like this. In the age of chainmail hauberks and shield walls, the hammer would have been a poor choice on the battlefield more often than not. The time it would take to wind your arm back and swing a hammer, because they were usually heavier than contemporary axes, would have left a warrior vulnerable by wasting precious moments. In those kinds of battlefields during the Viking Age, wasted seconds literally meant life or death. Besides, the hammer designs of the early 8th to late 9th centuries didn't have a backspike added to them at all. As I've said at the beginning of the video, they were mainly construction tools. Many feudal levies were part-time soldiers, meaning they couldn't afford to be away from their homes and farms for most of the year. Of course, they would have brought whatever they could afford to take for themselves in terms of weapons and armor, often poorly equipped on campaign compared to future professional armies. But in this age, the hammer was definitely not the dominant weapon. Besides, in Charles Martel's case, the Muslim attackers didn't even have enough clothing to properly prepare themselves for the fast approaching winter, much less armor that was sturdy enough to repel spears and axes. Throughout the testing grounds of the Renaissance, the warhammer was a popular choice for cracking open armor on the battlefield. But as pike and shot warfare started to take precedence, the warhammer would eventually be phased out in favor of arquebusiers and pike phalanxes, supported by light cavalry and artillery. Thanks to its long and storied history, rest assured you'll own a true piece of the Renaissance when you get this authentic warhammer. Also, thank you for joining me on this adventure. Bring a lasting symbol of strength and power into your arsenal today from our website at medievalcollectibles.com. And don't forget to subscribe for more content in the future.